week. And for those of you who haven't seen the first show, or the first webinar, we last time talked about kind of an intro to compassion fatigue and burnout, and focused on some of our core contemplative practices to help us manage stress. And today we're going to focus more on managing our workload, our perceptions of work and our time. And so I want to welcome back those who were here last time and welcome the new people. And we have a couple of two more short polls so that we could kind of hear a little bit about, for people who saw the first one, if you have tried anything new from an action step or something you identified last time, and if you feel like sharing, how did it go?
This one with the poll. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Surprisingly more complicated.
So we're trying to work out how we do the polling.
Then I guess I'll have to close the Did You Watch? Oh, no. Sorry.
So you can only do one poll at a time, it looks like.
I apologize, guys. It's something I'm still trying to figure out. There we go. So the one that I want to close is
Can you do two at the same time?
I think we can.
Because the second one is for those of you who did try an action step. If you feel like sharing, we'd love to hear what you tried and how it worked for you.
Wondering if I can make this bigger. Sorry, I'm worried that I'm moving it and making it difficult for people to access, but I just want to try to get everybody to be able to respond. There we go.
Okay, that looks good. So when we do this training in person, we usually start off by having a small group activity where people talk about how their action step worked or didn't work, and do some celebrating or problem solving together. So for those of you who weren't able to try an action step from last week, there might be some ideas that you can see on this screen that could be helpful for you. And then today we'll also talk about some scheduling activities, and you might be able to think about how might you schedule this into your daily workflow that could be helpful. So that's great. Can people still do this while we move on, or do we need to
I think
close
that we
it?
can only have one pod available, so if you share your screen, it'll overcome the poll. Like, they won't be able to see both at the same time.
Oh, okay. Will they have access to any of this?
It'll be included in training, so at the end. When we finish the webinar after the Q&A this week, anybody who receives the archive, I'm just going to leave the poll up. So if you'd like to see the results, you can see that at the end of the webinar.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, well, let's move on to our new content. So if I hit that button, share my screen, we should be able to get back, right? Okay. So our plan for today, we'll start with another contemplative practice to kind of get us back into that space of relaxation and well-being. And then we'll talk about two main areas that can help us manage our workload. The first area will be how we think about our work, and we can do that through challenging negative thoughts or focusing on the more positive aspects of our work. And then we'll focus on some ideas about reclaiming our time. So it's not just about time management, but how do we make the most of our time that we do have. And then next week, for our final webinar, we will focus on connecting with colleagues in the community. And for those of you who are new, we identified these components based on the survey that many of you did to identify the key areas that were most challenging or stressful in your work. So managing all of our work with very little time and having some difficulties interacting with patrons or colleagues at work. So that's how we came to focus on these three areas. And like last time, we'll be taking some time to reflect and write throughout the webinar. So if you have the toolkit handy, that's great. I'll refer to specific pages for that. And if you don't have the toolkit handy, there is a place for you to download it, or you can just have a scrap piece of paper where you might want to sketch some ideas or notes.
I think maybe I need to minimize the screen because I can't see the chat box, and I'm wondering, there we go.
Okay, so you can see. Okay. So we'll start with our refresher contemplative practice. And this is a new practice that will be a guided imagery exercise, and it builds on some of the breathing techniques that we did last week, but it will add me kind of talking you through imagining a scene that can help reduce stress at work. And so what I'd like you to do is we'll start with our deep breathing exercise, the diaphragmatic breathing where you try to fill up your lungs and expand your stomach. And then as you breathe out, you'll feel your stomach go back in towards your spine. So if you feel comfortable, I'd like you to get into a comfortable position. And then if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes or just keep kind of a soft focus so that you're relaxing your eyes. And go ahead and take some of those deep breaths, extending your stomach out as you inhale. And notice your stomach coming back in as you exhale. As you're breathing, notice how it sounds. You might notice how it feels, the temperature of the air coming in and out. As you're focusing on your breathing, I'd like you to imagine that you have a small wooden box in front of you. Open the lid of the box. Now imagine yourself placing all of your current worries into that box. These might be worries or stressors from work or family, or maybe other concerns that you have today. Take all of those worries and place them into the box. Now close the box and put it to the side. Your cares are safe and you can come back to them later. But for now, take a deep breath and enjoy the lightness that comes with putting your worries aside. Breathe deeply in and out, noticing the gentle rise and fall of your stomach. With your next breath, bring to mind an intention you have for yourself today for your wellness. What do you want to do for yourself today? So take another breath or two, and then you can open your eyes and join us again. Okay, so that's kind of a short exercise that you can do at transition points, maybe when you're starting your work day or when you get home, as a way to kind of leave your work worries aside and transition into your home time. So now focusing on how we think about our work, there's a long tradition, even from Buddhist writings, about the importance of our thoughts to who we are. And then there's a quote I like from Hamlet: "There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." And both of these really emphasize how important our thoughts are for shaping how we think about things, how we evaluate them, and who we are. And as psychologists, we talk about a model of how our thoughts come in between actions out in the world and how we feel. So when you get cut off in traffic, that doesn't automatically make you feel mad. It's usually some belief or underlying thought about what that action means that makes us feel angry. And so we have this model where we talk about some activating event or something that happens outside of us, and then our beliefs. Some of them are rational beliefs, some of them maybe are irrational, but those lead to consequences of how we feel and how we act. And we can interrupt that cycle by disputing those beliefs in the middle, the things that are maybe irrational or not so helpful, and that can lead to a new emotional state. And we call this cognitive restructuring. And it's really just about trying to catch those negative, irrational, or stressful thoughts, and then trying to recognize those distortions or inaccuracies. And sometimes it might even be an accurate thought, but it might not be so helpful. And so trying to catch those things and then replace them with a more realistic or valid thought or a healthier thought. And on your toolkit on page 8, there are some common thoughts that lead people to feel stressed at work. And so I've taken one of those thoughts and come up with an activating event. So on the toolkit, I took thought number 8. And the activating event might be Joe the patron is angry, he's made a mean comment to you, and he stomped out of the library. And so if you believe, I have done so much for that patron and he is always complaining, then you can imagine how you might feel. So you might be resentful or angry. Well, what if you caught yourself and instead you tried to replace that with a more helpful thought? So one example might be telling yourself, well, it's too bad that Joe doesn't seem to appreciate the help I give. It's still an accurate description, but it places the issue outside of yourself and you're more of an observer. And so that might lead you to feeling maybe empathic for Joe rather than so angry or upset. Or another thought might be, looks like he's having another bad day. I won't let that bring me down. So there are different kind of strategies you might use to think about replacing negative thoughts. Another common negative thought is that maybe you're too busy to take care of yourself. So that is thought number 10 on that page in the toolkit. So maybe an activating event is you realize your signs of burnout are at an all-time high and your friend or partner wants you to take a week-long trip. Well, if your belief is, I can't take time off now because it's too busy and others need me, how would that make you feel? So it probably adds to your sense of burden and being overwhelmed. But maybe a more helpful thought could be that taking time off will give me energy to be more productive. Or, we all need time to recharge. This might help others make healthy decisions. So the key when we're doing cognitive restructuring is looking for those reoccurring kind of negative thoughts and interrupting them. And so when you catch yourself having a thought that is perhaps leading you to feel more upset or angry or stressed, to kind of stop, maybe take a deep breath, and then focus on the thought. And some helpful self-statements I think about are, if you can change this situation, then why worry? Because you have the power to do something about it. And if you can't change it, then why worry? Because there's nothing you can do about it. So you need to kind of move on. Or another thought is, when you're starting to feel stressed, really challenging yourself. Is it really that the work is always this difficult, or is today just a difficult moment, or this thing difficult? So we can focus on changing some of those negative thoughts by catching them and switching to a more positive thought. We can also change how we think about our work by focusing on meaning and gratitude. And Viktor Frankl, of course, is someone who's written about that purpose and meaning in our lives through his Holocaust experiences. I like this quote, that suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds meaning. So we have an exercise, but it takes a little bit more time. So this is something I thought maybe you could do on your own in the toolkit, to really think about a moving experience of something that happened to you at work, and write it down. And write down how you responded, how it affected you. Think a little bit about what that says about what's important to you. And if you're going through this series with a colleague, you might consider sharing with them. This can be a real powerful way to develop those connections at work and focus on what motivates us and what keeps meaning in our lives. But I want you to spend a little time on that. So I would say maybe at your lunch break or something, you could spend a little time thinking about that. As we focus on meaning in our work, we can also be thankful for those experiences that are positive at work. And gratitude itself has been correlated with lots of individual benefits. People who have a higher sense of gratitude also have higher life satisfaction, optimism, and energy. And there have been several studies of interventions to help people do a gratitude practice, like a daily kind of activity where they focus on things that they're grateful for. And these tend to show small but positive effects on well-being compared to a lot of different types of comparison groups. And it looks like the modality or the way you do gratitude doesn't really seem to matter. So you can make verbal statements, you can write lists, you can journal. One fun practice that we like to do in the evening at the dinner table with our family is to go around and say what's either the best thing that happened to you today, or what's one thing you feel thankful for from today. And we go around and share that. And sometimes we do different, like multiple rounds, so that we get past recess or the easy ones that people say. And so for us, I'd like us to do a quick exercise. If you have your toolkit, you can turn to page 10. And if you don't have your toolkit, just think about what is one thing about your work. It might include colleagues, patrons, anything that brings you joy and meaning. And just write down at least one thing that you feel grateful for. And then on that same page, what is one thing outside of work that you feel grateful for in your life? And so write down at least one thing. Now, tomorrow you can do the same reflection, but try to be aware of something new. And when you start to do this every day and trying it for a week or a month, you'll see that you become much more specific about things. You start noticing the small things throughout the day that really bring joy or make you feel good throughout the day. So that's a kind of a quick practice that can have some nice benefits for you. Okay. So now I'd like to kind of shift gears to another way to help manage our workload. Those first practices about cognitive strategies are really how we think about our work, and how we think about our work can reduce the perceived burden and feel like we're doing much better in terms of how things are going at work. And this part will focus more on how we think about our time and how we use our time. And really, that's one of our most precious resources. When people get to the end of their lives, very rarely do they wish that they had worked more or wish that they had gone to another meeting. It's really focusing more on spending those quality moments and having time with loved ones and things that bring meaning to us. So our goals are to think about trying to do less of the things that diminish you or take away from your energy and sense of well-being, and doing more of the things that you love and that renew you, and using skills and tools to help with both of these. And we have 3 major strategies that we do that. And first, we'll talk about how to set some compassionate boundaries and limits. And then we can focus on ways to organize your time to be more efficient with how you do things. And then the last section is really to think about how we change our approach and our experience of time. So the first one is around setting boundaries, and we talk about defining compassionate boundaries because we want to be compassionate to ourselves, giving yourself space, but also you can do it in a way that's compassionate towards your colleagues, the patrons, the supervisors you work with as well. And we think about defining boundaries in different areas. The first area is how much you work. Are you working 40 hours a week, or are you working more like 60, 70 hours a week? How much are you being paid for in that time, and how much does your work call for? And so there may be ways to set boundaries around the amount of time you're working. The second area to think about is how much you integrate work with the rest of your life. And so you might set boundaries about this time is for my work and this time is for my personal life. And there's some research about people have different styles. So there are segmenters who like very strong boundaries and integrators who kind of blend work and family life. And I'm much more of an integrator, so I actually like to work Saturday mornings. It often makes me feel like I'm getting a jump on my week. And so I usually set aside some time on Saturday to do work. And I really enjoy doing work by the pool. And so I like to sit by the pool while I do some of my work. But I have a colleague and good friend who says if she's at the pool, she wants to be reading a novel, and the last thing she wants to do is focus on work. So you can think about that as your own personal choice about what really works well for you and what feels good, a good use of your time. And the third area about setting boundaries is what you do with your work time. So all of us have to do things that we might not enjoy doing, but I'm sure all of us are doing things that we could be saying no to, that we tend to take on projects or activities or do things that aren't necessary all of the time. And so there are places where you might be able to look at your work and what you're doing, and can you say no to some of those things. And I think something that's really important to remember is that every time you say yes to something, you're implicitly saying no to something else. And that might be saying no to time at home in the evening. It might be saying no to your weekend family activities. It might be saying no to another project you have going on. So when you say yes to something, you have to take that time from something else. And so we really need to make good choices about that. And sometimes it's hard to say no. So we need to think about how do we say no to supervisors or colleagues, people that we want to have good working relationships with. We don't want to let them down, and there's often a sense of responsibility. And so I have often found that if you share that you are trying to work on work-life balance issues and that you are trying to be more careful about things that you take on, that people tend to respect that. And it also sets kind of a good tone or example. For supervisors, I think oftentimes supervisors don't recognize how much is on your plate. And supervisors often don't recognize how long things take. So the farther away a supervisor gets from having done those activities themselves, the less perspective they have on all of the things that go into it or can go wrong or that happen. So sometimes having a conversation directly about that and saying to your supervisor, here are all the things that are on my plate right now. What would you like me to take off of my plate so I can make room for this new thing? Or what on my plate can go on the back burner? So can you help me prioritize because I'm not able to get all of this done simultaneously? And sometimes those conversations are challenging, and we'll talk about that next week in interacting with colleagues and having challenging conversations. But they're really worth thinking about and taking that time to do that so that you can help manage your workload in a better way. Some areas to think about how you can start setting boundaries or what things you might try to do less of. I think this comes from Stephen Covey's work on efficient people. And he talks about how there are activities in the left-hand column that are urgent. They are time sensitive. They feel like they're pressing things. And then there are things that are not urgent, and those are on the right column. And then we can also divide our tasks into things that are important, and that's the top row going across, and things that are not really that important, and that's the bottom row going across. And often we confuse urgent with important. And so when things come up, we tend to try to respond to them right away without identifying how important it is. And so these are some quadrants you can think about. Things that are urgent and important really do need your time right away. And he gives some examples of things that might be important and urgent, and the focus is on managing those things. The things to the right that are important but not urgent, they're important, but because they're not urgent, they often get put aside and they get put on the back burner, and you'll get to that later. But he's saying these are things that might be important for you really to carve time out and to focus on. So preparation and planning, thinking about your values, exercising, focusing on relationships. Those are things that really are important, but because they're not urgent, we sometimes forget about them or put them to the side. And the things on the bottom are things that he really reminds us to try to avoid when we can. I know sometimes we can't avoid interruptions, but there are things we might do, like putting a sign on our door if you have an office space that you need this 10 minutes to yourself, or some of those things. Some of our jobs we can't really avoid interruptions, but we might be able to avoid responding to certain emails or some meetings or things like that. You have a little more control. And then the quadrant of waste, those are things that are not important and not urgent, and he says to avoid those altogether, like busy work, junk mail, viewing mindless TV. Sometimes that can help you relax, but there might be more effective ways of helping you relax. So those are some things you can think about in terms of trying to set boundaries around. Another place for boundaries are our smartphones. So like our minds, smartphones can be a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. And people are talking a lot more about this perpetual workday because we have these smartphones and access to email all of the time. It's really harder to turn off work and focus on fun and other things. And particularly with smartphones and electronic devices at night, there are physiological effects with the light that is emitted from those. Really interferes with your sleep. It affects the hormones. And then there are psychological effects. So checking your mail in the evening right before you go to bed, if you get some kind of irritating email, you can imagine then your mind is wandering and focusing on that email, and you're less likely to be able to calm down and go to sleep. And this can even be positive things. One time I checked my email at 10 o'clock at night and saw that I was going to be awarded a big grant, and I was so excited. And I couldn't sleep till like 4 in the morning because I was thinking about this new project. So really trying to limit when you're going to look at your smartphones and having that space. And in this particular study, using smartphones after 9 was associated with poorer sleep, more fatigue, and more disengagement from work. So after my grant experience, I really do try hard not to check my phone at night, my email. So another strategy is organizing your time. And when we organize our time, it helps us focus on setting goals and There's a lot of literature in psychology focusing on how when you set goals, that in and of itself starts to make us more productive. So setting goals and looking at how you're getting things done can really motivate you more. And organizing your time can also help limit wasteful activities, so it helps you set some of those boundaries around the things we might want to be avoiding or doing less of. And it helps ensure that you make time for the things you want to do. And really it is around making time. You've got to set aside time for things that bring meaning and purpose to your life and making sure that that happens. And so some general tips really are setting goals and prioritizing activities. So for me, I have a to-do list on I keep it on a Word document, and I have it prioritized by things I want to get done today, things that I want to get done later this week, and things that I'm waiting to hear back from other people. And that helps me because I check it every day. I check it sometimes several times a day, and I love crossing things off, and that makes me feel good, and I'm motivated to do the next thing. But it also helps keep in mind things that maybe you are waiting for other people and you haven't heard back from someone, and it helps to recognize that and kind of keep that still in your system. And then using a weekly schedule and beyond. So when you have projects that you're working on, you can identify when they're going to be due and setting smaller chunks of them when you want to get those chunks done. And that really helps to kind of physically put that on the calendar so you can see these are the things I need to get done within this week, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, so that I can meet those deadlines. And that can really help make that sense of time that you have set aside. And you can also schedule blocks of time for doing the things that eat up your time and drain your energy. And one of the big ones is blocking time for email responses. So instead of keeping your email open if you're at a work-related or a desk-related work, rather than continuously responding, set aside some time when you're going to focus on that. So for me, when I'm working on a work-related task, I turn off my email, and then after I've achieved a certain amount or I've worked for an hour on this project, then I let myself see my email for 10 minutes, and it's kind of my reward in a geeky way. I get to do something else for 10 minutes, and then I turn my email off and I go back and do something else. Same thing for returning or making phone calls. Most phone calls that you get are not urgent, and if you can set aside time, maybe later in the day at 3 o'clock, that's when I'm going to do all of my phone calls. It doesn't always work. Sometimes you have to do calls at certain times, but the more you can start to block off those things that drain your energy, the better. And meetings, that's another thing that, at least in academia, come up a lot. We get requests to do lots of different meetings. And so you might have in mind, is there a maximum quota, a guideline you can use for yourself of how many hours a week you can literally spend in meetings? And if something is not urgent, can you suggest that they put it off till another week or minimize the time? And also asking if you have an agenda for the meeting, or what is the purpose of the meeting when people set them up. Sometimes people just want to talk to you about something, and it might be more efficiently done over email or a 10-minute meeting rather than an hour. So you could think about making sure you have a clear purpose if you're setting a meeting, and asking for one if someone else is setting. And when you're doing work, you can think about the timing. If you're scheduling work for you, what activities are best for you in the morning? What activities are best for you later in the day? So in my role, I have to do a lot of writing, and I am best at that in the morning when I'm fresh. And so I try to do those things in the morning, and I save my meeting time for students or other faculty later in the day. So you might think about that in terms of timing. And then the third area is to think about our strengths. And so trying to schedule around your strengths. And there's a place in the toolkit on page 12. And if you just have a piece of paper, you can just write down. Think about, what do you identify as some of your strengths? And just take a moment to reflect on that and write down some of your strengths. And sometimes it's hard for us, if we're modest, to think about our strengths, but what do you think your colleagues and other people who know you well would identify as your strengths? And it can help you think about those things too. And you could think about blocking a time in your schedule to do an activity that builds on your strengths. So are there certain tasks in the library that you're really good at? Do you like arranging social gatherings? Is there something that you could do to help with the morale in your library? If you're good at that, maybe doing something around a social gathering. Do you like mentoring students or junior colleagues? If so, maybe you want to build in an hour a week where you're meeting with someone and helping provide some guidance or direction, some mentoring time. And you can do the same thing for your values and what brings meaning and joy to your work, and trying to think about what are some goals or activities that could reflect that. And so you can build into your schedule a time to work on some of those goals and activities. And so when you do that meaning exercise on page 9, there's a spot on page 13 where you can really think about, well, what are some other activities you might want to schedule? And really, a lot of this is about changing or regaining your perspective. Instead of focusing on what needs to be done, focusing on what is the best use of my time, what is worth doing, and what renews my energy and hope. So those are things that can be very helpful for us to think about when we're thinking about our work. So on page 14 of our toolkit, there's a place for us to kind of do a little summary activity based on all of these different areas we talked about for setting boundaries and scheduling. So on page 14, you might take a moment and say, what is at least one thing you could say no to and cut out from your time? And what's one thing that you could more effectively limit and gain time by setting boundaries around? And then if you redirect some of your time, what could you do that would build more on your strengths and bring more meaning to your work? So what's one thing you might want to even add to your schedule, but that would bring more sense of purpose and joy in your work? So when I do this in person, I can usually see when people put their pens down, but on the webinar, it's hard to know. So I'll go ahead and move on, but you might take more time, again, to come back to some of these activities to think more about them. So the third strategy in reclaiming our time is really thinking about how we approach situations, and it can change our experience of time. So one area is multitasking, and so it's really a myth that the electronics and multitasking is making us more efficient. The cognitive research is saying that for complex tasks that we do together or in rapid succession, we really are less effective. And so it's really only an illusion that doing all this multitasking makes us more efficient. It actually takes away from our ability to focus. And you will find, I used to be a great multitasker, and sometimes I still am, but I try now to focus on one thing at a time. And it makes my perception of time so much broader. I feel like I have more time when I'm focusing on one thing rather than hectically trying to do these other things. And it actually makes you more efficient in the long run when you focus rather than trying to multitask. So what are some factors that can help our experience of time? Mindfulness activities. So being mindful really helps us use that limited time more effectively. And so some of those breathing exercises, I think we only did one mindfulness one where we were breathing and we were focusing on the sounds that we hear around us. But if you're focusing on that task in front of you and being mindful about that experience of time really expands, and you feel less rushed and you feel like you have more space. We can also help our experience of time by our cognitive and attitudinal ideas. And so this kind of ties in the first part of this webinar, where how we think about our work makes a difference. And so if you think work is a drag, it probably will be. Time will go. The more you watch the clock, the longer it goes. So if you follow the 7 dwarfs and you whistle while you work, it actually can make you feel better. So focusing on the positive aspects. And the third area is really the sense of intentionality, and it's mindfully bringing your focus to something. And a lot of our time mentally, some of us spend a lot of our time focusing on the past, like what I said this morning and was that the right thing or not. A lot of us spend our time focusing on the future. What are my plans? How am I going to get this project done? And when we spend time ruminating on the past or anticipating future events, it really robs us of that focus on the present. And we have to kind of relearn bringing ourselves back to that experience. And some ways that you can do that are trying to clear your thoughts to focus, so directly on this task or the person in front of you. And so kind of a gentle reminder to yourself, no matter how busy I am, if someone is approaching you, you can say, this 2 minutes is for this patron. I'm just going to focus on what this person needs. And then you can kind of go back. It's a way to kind of segment that. You can also use imagery, like the exercise we did at the beginning, to leave your troubles in a box or a briefcase. That can help if you're having a particularly stressful time at home. When you get to work, you could do that imagery exercise to put everything from home in a little box so that you can focus on your work, and then you can focus on the other things later. And another way to be intentional is to get those least happy minutes of your day back. So last week I showed results from a survey from the Work and Health Survey, and the last activity that is the least happiness is commuting. So if you have to commute, you might try enjoying music or learning a language, books on tape, podcasts. And so those can be a way to be more intentional about those least happy minutes of your day. So we're at the end of our material for today, and I wanted you again to take one thing that you want to take away from today that you would like to try in your life next week. And really write it down and think about what's one thing you want to try. And as we said last time, SMART goals are ideal if you can be more specific. Measurable. How many times do you want to do this? When do you want to do it? Pick a goal that's achievable. So you can't set boundaries and say no to everything at work, but something that you could achieve and that's important to you or relevant, and that has kind of a time. This is something I'm going to do within this week, or I'm going to do this on Wednesday afternoon. So that's all of my material for today, and I wanted to open it up if there are questions that people have been typing in, or and if things come up again later after the webinar, feel free to email me or contact me on here.
Well, Diane was wondering if you couldn't make the PowerPoint deck available so she could interfile some of the slides into the toolkit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Yeah, I can include these slides with the next mailing of LEUs. Does anybody have any other additional questions? I see that Violet has raised her hand. Hi, Violet. Did you have a question for Michelle? Nicole, yes. I'm in the process of transcribing last week's webinar, and once the transcription's done, everybody who registered for last week but hadn't had the opportunity to actually attend will receive a copy of the archived recording. For now, only people who actually attended last week's webinar have received direct links. That doesn't have the closed captioning added yet. Okay. Well, if nobody has any questions, I think that's going to be it for us today. Thank you guys for attending.
Great.